Hello and welcome to the video for my essay, The Marxian Critique of Rights in the UAB. This is an attempt to answer the question of what would a Marxian critique of the rights-based approach in the UAB look like. The debate on Marxian thought and rights has been ongoing for many years, and it has been focused on particular approaches such as the French Declaration of the Man and the Citizen, and further by another author, Lux, on the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Today we will be discussing a very particular set of rights, and that is students' rights as discussed in the statutes of the UAB. The structure of the essay will be to first discuss the Marxian parameters for the general critique of rights, and then to see the UAB's rights-based approach. How have rights been criticized? We shall focus on Luke's critique, and there are 2 points that he mainly makes, and that is first the egotistical and liberal nature of rights as discussed in the Jewish question, and then how have human rights been portrayed as absolutes while they are not attained in an absolute way. So firstly, in the Jewish question, if we look at the concepts of the young Karl Marx, we get the concepts of abstraction and atomization that can be directly applied to this critique. Abstraction would be the separation of the political from the civic, and that being that we have a very abstract set of rights that is then not concreted in civic society. So let's take the concept of equality, for example. This separation becomes quite catastrophic when defending rights, as they only do so in a very abstract, political, formal way, if you might, while in the material conditions of the people, equality is not real. And that has happened in, for example, the French Declaration of Man and the Citizen, that declares that all men and citizens, not women, are equal, while when in the material sphere they are not. And then atomization, which would refer to this egotistical nature, because since rights are portrayed from an individual point of view, they draw individuals apart from each other, and they don't attain to the collective nature of humans. And then for Lux, he criticized human rights because they claim to be absolute when they can never be absolute. That is because 2 things. First, there are a lot of rights, particularly socioeconomic rights, that depend on the availability of resources. So if resources in one instance are not available, these rights stop being absolute. And then he also criticized rights because they can always be overridden in very concrete situation, and he points out some philosophical hypothetical scenarios where basically even the right to not be tortured could be overridden. So how do these rights apply to the UAB? Well, we shall first look at why it is important to draw this distinction. By this particular author, Boyd, the types of right is the main point to which one can argue for rights from a Marxian standpoint. That is because Marx specifies in the Jewish question that he is talking about the French Declaration of Man and the Citizen and the US Constitution. So that is not a mere clarification, but it can lead to us thinking that Marx did think that some rights had to be critiqued in a different way than others. Then because Marx draws a distinction between the rights of men and the rights of the citizen, because the man refers to something individual, but the citizen refers to something collective and gives collective rights, and he is much more critical of the former than the latter. And then Boyd also points out the historical nature of rights. We shall not draw Marx's critique out of his context. And one could argue that the context today and in 2025, where the statutes of the UAB were redacted, has changed quite a lot from Marx's. So let's focus on the specific parameters. We talked about abstraction, how this formal abstract sphere may not particularly traduce to this translate to the particular rights. So the main difference between the rights in the French Declaration of the Man and the Citizen and the rights in the UAB is that the statutes describe very concrete set of rights. Let's take into account maybe the right to having proper installation and spaces for the students. So this is not like equality. It's very easy to see if the installations are not proper. Moreover, if the right to have proper installations is there and is in the statutes, but then in reality the installations were not proper, one would see this as a contradiction. This did not happen in the Jewish question. Marx described a secular state when in reality we had very religious individuals. This wasn't seen as a contradiction in the liberal states. While if we see a difference between what is in the statutes and what is then happening, this would be a contradiction. So there's quite a difference here. Then if we talk about atomization, could we say that this, instead of the rights of students, are the rights of egotistical students? Well, there's two things that could be argued. Firstly, that the framing of the students' rights is from an individual standpoint. They talk about drets de l'estudiant and not drets dels estudiants. So that is already a very simple difference. They don't refer to the totality of the student body, but they frame it from an individual point. And that has a very serious consequence, and it is that it puts all students in the same position. And that ignores the structures in our society that make students not be in the same position, particularly of class. It doesn't distinguish between the socioeconomic differences that students may have. But from another point, the content of these rights is again vastly different from that in the French Declaration. Marx was very critical of the liberal rights: liberty, property, security, and in the statutes there's rights. These rights are not mentioned, firstly, and second, that they appeal to a very different set of rights. For example, the right of associate that Marx did defend on a letter to Engels, and also the right to strike, which are very collective rights, although reduced from a very individual stand. And then the critique of Luke's that human rights can never be attained, I would argue that it doesn't translate to the UAB's rights. And that is because there's a difference between human rights, who claim to be these moral absolutes that have to always happen, and the rights in the UAB, who only claim some material conditions within faculty limits. And it is much easier to attain in a material way the second than the first. But regardless, how are these rights guaranteed? We have the ombudsperson, that is an organism that one can appeal if they feel their rights have been not fulfilled. And so what I would argue is that the UAB's rights are what they claim to be. They are a threshold for the conditions of students, and if they are not met, one can appeal, and the ombudsperson can easily distinguish if these rights are fulfilled or if they're not. And so, to draw a conclusion from this, it is that The UAB's rights are very different than those in the French Declaration of the Man and the Citizen. While they can't be compared in a general standpoint, some tools like the atomization and all of these parameters can be used to draw a comparison. However, we must not extrapolate the negative approach that Marx had to liberal rights to the rights-based approach in the UAB. So that is my point, and this is the end.